درود به مردم شریف ایران. من شهریار افشار هستم، میزبان شما در Politics 365. امروز مجددا آقای جاناتان هارونوف دعوت شده به برنامه از نیویورک. ایشون یه جورنالیست هست در نیویورک، اما در زمینه خاورمیانه و مخصوصا در یک صاحب نظر و کارشناس در سابقه اسرائیل و جنگایی که اسرائیل با حماس داشته در خاورمیانه و مخصوصا این حوادث چند ماه اخیر که متاسفانه تمام افکار دنیا رو گرفته تا حدی که ما هی دولت ایران رو مقصر میدونن و هی مردم فلسطین بیگناه جونشون رو از دست میدن و مخصوصا مردم بیگناه اسرائیلی که اکتبر 7 به دست حماس کشته شدن یا گروگان شدن. خلاصه آقای هارونوف مجددا به برنامه برگشته که بتونه ما رو یه ذره آگاهی بیشتری برام فراهم کنه، ما رو روشن‌تر کنه در این موضوع و یه ذره چند تا ازش سوال کنیم که واقعا آینده اسرائیل و فلسطین چی هست. بقیه برنامه به انگلیسی تهیه شده، پس از اون لحاظ ما رو ببخشید. Jonathan Harounoff, welcome back to Politics 365, bearing with me for my very brief and abbreviated introduction. Please tell us a little bit quickly about your background again, and let's just jump into the latest events and start with what we think is the communication between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu, and what many observe as some of a public rift or a disagreement between how fast Israel should withdraw or stop its military campaign and not go into Rafah, and what to do about helping the innocent people of Palestine. So welcome back. Let's start with that.
Well, thanks so much for having me on your show again, Shahriar. It's great to be with you. My name's Jonathan Harounoff. I'm a journalist based in New York, focusing primarily on Israel, Iran, and the broader Middle East. And to your question, the past 4 months have been, very difficult for both Israelis and Palestinians, and Israel has stayed firm in its stated twin goals of eliminating Hamas while also freeing the hostages who have been held, innocent hostages who have been held by Hamas for far too long. And we know now that there are around 130 hostages still held, and around 30 of them are presumed to have been killed while in captivity, which is tragic news. To your question about the relationship or the deterioration of relations between President Biden and Netanyahu, it's important to state that this isn't a relationship that started on October the 7th. Netanyahu and Biden have known each other, have been friends for around 40 years. And there's a very well-known anecdote that Biden wrote Netanyahu a note once saying that, he wrote, "Bibi, I love you, but I don't agree with the damn thing that you have ever said." And that, I'm sure, remains true to this day. So while there may be some public disagreements between what Biden and his administration want to do in terms of Israel's war in Gaza, the support transcends any prime minister in Israel, and it also transcends any specific president. The relationship between Israel and the United States is very firm, and it's true to this conflict as well, because the war between Israel and Hamas isn't confined to Gaza. It's a much broader conflict that also involves, extremely powerful foes in the Islamic Republic of Iran, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen, and all of those forces have already directly impacted the US as well.
Yeah. No, thank you for mentioning that and reminding us of the longevity of their relationship. They've both been statesmen for decades, been on the international stage for many, many years. And but they also, from a personality standpoint, they bring very different things to the table, right? So Netanyahu, former IDF military, definitely his persona is a strong man. and as opposed to Biden, who I think prides himself as a diplomat, less of a strong man. And those are both their strengths and weaknesses, because I think in this country, especially the Republican Party, looks at Biden and sees that his weakness or his lack of projecting strength in the Middle East and maybe even Ukraine prompted strong opposition from Putin and maybe in some degrees Iran. And by contrast, Netanyahu, even within Israel, we were observing before October 7 that some of his very strong policies were causing a great rift within Israeli society before October 7. But those personalities aside, what do you feel, how do we get out of this? I mean, Israel, really, Netanyahu's government is projecting more ground action. Meanwhile, the loss of innocent life is just becoming incalculable. There's very little hope for the future, and some of the infrastructure destruction in the Gaza Strip, I don't know when they'll be repaired. I mean, it makes that most of the Gaza Strip uninhabitable. So how do we go from almost an uninhabitable, let's say there's a ceasefire in 30 days, to uninhabitable society in Gaza Strip, to a two-state solution or peace or releasing? I mean, there's so much between here and there that caused by damage while going after the terrorist Hamas infrastructure, right? How do we get there from there?
Well, there's an extremely long way to go. And as you rightly pointed out, even once there's a ceasefire, whether temporary or full-time ceasefire, the post-Hamas Gaza, it's very important to have a plan in place so that something like this doesn't happen again, because, you can't have a force like Hamas stay in power if you want sustainable peace, which is something that I dearly want, and I'm sure many of your listeners want as well, because you want a stable, secure, prosperous Israel, and you also want the Palestinians to have stability, security, peace, and you can't have that when it's governed by a force that doesn't take its own interests at heart and is much more focused on killing people as opposed to protecting their own. So whatever future Gaza looks like, it needs to be governed by either a single party or force or a coalition of forces that prioritize the safety of the Palestinians over the destruction of the state of Israel.
Do you feel if Hamas is no more, that the good and innocent and honest people of Palestine and the Gaza Strip will be able to govern? The Palestinian Authority aside, let's say, would they be able to stand up on their own and still maintain whatever resistance, political resistance, or debate, however which way you want to characterize it, with the Israeli government about the settlements or all the issues of concern, two-state solution, without creating another vacuum where Hamas 2.0 could evolve in 6 months or a year?
That's why post-war planning is absolutely critical, and it's as critical a mission as the fighting itself, so that you don't create a vacuum, and so that a Hamas 2.0 doesn't emerge and just perpetuate this horrible fighting. I don't know if it's the $1 million question right now. I don't know if the force that comes after Hamas in Gaza is a single political movement, whether it's the PA, which hasn't been that convincing, or a coalition of forces in the region who have a vested interest in the prosperity of the Palestinians. And that's why this isn't just Israel's problem to deal with. This the Arab world, which has shown sympathy to the Palestinian cause, should also step up and sort of turn its sympathy into action. And it can do that by taking part in this post-war planning and making sure that Gaza is as prosperous a place as any place in the Middle East, as Dubai, as Tel Aviv, so that war doesn't reoccur.
It's thank you for mentioning the role of the other Arab states. I was puzzled about this until I studied it, and I learned that the answer to the other million-dollar question, which is why doesn't the Arab states around Israel and the Gaza Strip be more accommodating towards the Palestinian people or let them in? And the answer that I got was every time over the past few decades that has happened, the Palestinians were allowed to go and migrate to other countries around Israel and the Gaza Strip. They began to sow discontent. They began to rebel and push that society into a conflict which it didn't want and it didn't have with Israel. So now all those Arab states have their walls built around the Gaza Strip, and they're not, apart from a few, I don't know how many refugees are around in some, but for the most part, there's probably more Latin Americans coming over the American southern border than there are Palestinians going over to the Arab states next door. So is that still the case? I mean, when you say the Arab states should do more, shouldn't it start with letting war refugees come to their countries?
I can't comment on what, policies should be of any particular Arab state, but I also don't necessarily think that the way Arab states can get involved is to just, encourage the migration of Palestinians from Gaza. It's also to focus on those Palestinians who don't want to leave Gaza, but also disavow Hamas and making sure that they have, the tools, the infrastructure, as you mentioned, the sort of stable economy and a life, so that they don't have to resort to the fanatical elements of their society, and they can focus on themselves, they can focus on peace. But there's no doubt that there's a lot of things that the Arab world can do, and but it's also that there's a balance that they need to strike. If you look at Saudi Arabia, for example, before October the 7th, there was so much momentum towards Israeli-Saudi normalization, and some say that may have even been what caused Hamas to carry out these attacks to sort of stop any such normalization from occurring. So it's in Saudi Arabia sees that it's in its interest, in its security interest, diplomatic interest, to have these relations with Israel. But at the same time, it has publicly expressed sympathy for the Palestinians. It's the sort of protector of Islam, and it's the protector of some of the most holiest sites in Islam, and it's got this bond with Palestinians. So it's got to strike this sort of balance between the two, and I hope to see more of that.
It's a very difficult solution and crisis, and it seems every generation is dealing with another version of this conflict, right? In fact, the movie Golda is on HBO right now, and I've watched it several times. And the Yom Kippur War, and every decade, the 6-Day War. I mean, you have all these constant attacks by Arab states and Arab forces on Israel since its inception, and every generation, honestly, is saddled with the same problem. How do we contribute to Middle East peace between these two states? It just becomes harder and harder, because the same people, those fanatical elements, I think you're mentioning, 100% true, in Hamas, they weren't born fanatical. They grew up in an environment where fanaticism was cultivated, and it took shape in the minds of the youth. And as soon as they could bear arms, they became victims of a fanatical philosophy, which maybe they inherited from their environment, from their parents. I don't know. But now we have another generation impacted by war. They've lost their siblings, their loved ones, what have you. It seems like whatever solution we can come up with now, it needs to be generationally looking forward to cultivate a sense of tolerance between these two people that have so much in common. As they say, they have more in common than not. But so I kind of, just from a societal standpoint, I want to hear your cultural standpoint. I want to hear your thoughts on that, and then I want to turn to Iran in the few minutes we have left.
There are so many similarities, and when I'm, people in Israel oftentimes refer to their, Palestinians or their Arab neighbors as cousins, as Bnei Dodim, which means cousins in Hebrew. But in terms of this generational in finding a solution to it, that's why it's such a difficult problem to solve, because you don't just want to solve it for 1 year, for 2 years, 5 years. It needs to sort of be a permanent solution, and in order to achieve that, you need something drastic. And we, in the past few decades, we've seen some momentum, sometimes we get close to a solution, but we've never quite got there yet. And the scary thing for me is that this Middle East conflict hasn't stayed confined to the Middle East. If you just look at, it's also expanded and morphed in all sorts of ways. If, for example, on college campuses, people who may have never ever been to the Middle East before have suddenly taken very strong stances, polarizing stances, suddenly, seen other students who support other, movements, or, for example, pro-Palestinians against pro-Israelis. There's been so much polarization, so much disinformation, and social media has played a huge role in that. And it's scary as well, because we've reached a point where this conflict isn't always grounded in truth and facts. It's grounded in a lot of misinformation that's spurred on by social media. So it's just added another dimension to a war, a conflict that was already extremely difficult to solve.
100% true. Any conflict, I remember the 1979 Iranian Revolution. There were, all kinds of incendiary rumors being spread by the revolutionary forces, I guess, against the Shah, which I think misled many people into believing that that Khomeini had a better solution, which clearly didn't work out for 45 years. And now when you add to it, we have this brewing conflict. Social media just exasperates an already impossible situation. In a couple of minutes we have left, let me ask you about Iran. Of course, Iran has been feeding Hamas and Hezbollah, and I just have to wonder, if Iran wasn't here, the regime, not the country, if the Iranian regime wasn't here, would Hamas and Hezbollah have any feet to stand on? Would there be another supporter? That's one half of the question. And the second half is, I think if Iran were to, they would get more diplomatic or regional power by being peace brokers like Qatar, instead of being terrorism sponsors. I mean, how do you feel about those two?
Iran as a country is an enormous, beautiful place with, thousands of years of history. To your first question, we almost got the answer to that in the Mahsa Amini protest, but we got a sort of glimpse of what the people wanted, what they were fighting for, and what a future Iran could look like. Unfortunately, we didn't get quite there, but it depends on what would come after the current regime. If it was a different force that was very similar to the current regime, we probably wouldn't see a change. But if it was a more secular, freer society, then we may have a more prosperous Iran that focuses more on, being this powerhouse in the Middle East that's going to force peace in a good way, as opposed to one that wants to sow discord and destruction and chaos in the Middle East, which is what we've seen it do now. And an important point to remember is we've seen the Islamic Republic of Iran, through its proxy network, cause so much chaos and destruction in the Middle East in the past couple months through its proxies of Hezbollah, Hamas, and Houthis, that we forget that it's also causing a lot of pain and destruction to its own people inside Iran. And that's what prompted the, Mahsa Amini's death didn't occur in isolation. She was one of many young women who were persecuted and ended up losing their lives. So it's important to remember that it's playing a dual destructive role in its own country and abroad as well. And a future Iran, depends on what comes after it. It could be the most incredible country and force in the region, and it can also be another, again, equally destructive.
Yeah. Well, as we say in Iran, from your lips to God's ears, I hope Iran realizes its true potential. As a diaspora, we all know what's possible, and I feel like the Iranian people deserve much better. And the world will see the difference once, hopefully, this evolution in Iran takes its course and begins to move towards the right direction. Jonathan Harounoff, thank you so much for joining us again. We learned a lot. Please come back and see us soon.
Thank you so much for having me on.